All right, this is Mr. P again, back with lesson four. This video will finish out our study of lynching. Uh, and uh, I'm back at the slide. So before I continue, just a reminder: this is lesson four, which means this is midway through our study of lynching. So video three deals with the beginning of our study of lynching and mass lynching. And then the first two videos were background and introductory stuff. So, I encourage you to kind of follow them in order. So before we move on, I hope that you had a chance to engage with this interactive map that documents lynching uh, and read some of the stories this map captures. Like I said, you'll have noticed that there's a key that documents race. You'll notice that there are lots of lynchings of uh, Chinese folks and Latinx folks, mostly Mexican folks, Chicano folks in this region of the country. You'll notice that a lot of lynchings are concentrated in Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. However, there are four documented in Pennsylvania, one in Philadelphia. There are documented lynchings, in Detroit and in Chicago in this area, due to the mob violence and mass lynchings that occur in 1919. You'll notice that, I had mentioned there are a handful of Italians and a handful of Native Americans throughout that are documented here. So like I said, the vast majority of people impacted and targeted by lynching are Black Americans. But it does not just, it impacts a variety of people of color, including just a few Italians, which tells us, right, the ways in which certain white groups were not considered white. And I want to be clear about what I said earlier, right, that folks are assimilated into whiteness. That was a process, though. And there were certain groups that are considered white today who were not in the 18 and early 1900s. That process took place over time. And today, right, any Italian is as white as anyone else. Don't get me wrong. Right, there's ways in which that gets used as an excuse, as we've seen it, in Central's recent incident. But these traditionally, historically non-white groups that are white today. So just be aware of the ways in which race is a construct, but it's very real socially. So that's what you're seeing on this map, and I think it's just important to kind of point out. All right, so moving forward, just a few important things to know about lynching and how it's used as a tool for oppression. Right, people of color are targeted, and common targets were those who were financially successful and were soldiers returning from World War I. Right, not just World War I. We saw with Private Neely, soldiers returning from the Spanish-American War in the late 1890s are also targeted. But after World War I, there are a lot of Black soldiers who are targeted, and those who are financially successful are often targeted here. We'll talk more about that in the next video. Some lynchings involved accusations of crimes. The two most common crimes that people were accused of were murder and rape. Other lynchings did not involve accusation. But let's be clear, all of these lynchings occurred without any real trial. Many of these accusations were justification for the lynching and were false accusations. And so we'll talk more about that later. Some lynchings were known as spectacle lynchings. These involved crowds of white folks who would come to enjoy the lynching. They might picnic. They would take photos. They would put those photos on postcards, send those postcards to family and friends. There are even instances of pieces of bodies being collected as souvenirs. Spectacle lynchings are horrific and are important to understand in terms of how violence was used as a way to reestablish the hierarchy and assure people of their place in the hierarchy. Spectacle lynchings are, I think, one of the kind of, kind of horrific things about this particular study here. So a couple of things we talked about this on the map, but Chinese Americans are targeted in the West during the era of the gold rush and building railroads. One, you can read more about this at the NPR link here. I do want to mention one thing, which is that in California, there was a sign posted in Eureka in the late 1800s that said basically anybody, any Chinese person seen after a certain time is going to be hanged. And there were entire towns where they chased Chinese folks out of those towns to reestablish the town as a white town. This was intentional and sometimes came from a desire of, white folks out there working, wanting to maintain the work and the opportunities for profit for themselves. So, some of this violence ultimately culminates with the Chinese Exclusion Act, where Chinese immigration is barred for quite some time in this country. Chicanos are targeted in Texas and in the Southwest. Because immigration began to increase, especially in the 1900s. But also, let's remember, this area of the country was taken by the U.S. from Mexico. And so Chicanos had been living there for years, decades, many decades prior, and weren't immigrants, but were just kind of, had been living there for quite a while. I just want to highlight the story of Jovita Idar, who is who writes for her father's newspaper, and she's someone who documents the lynchings of Chicano people. So some of those lynchings that are recorded in that map are documented by Jovita Idar, who was a journalist who went to interview folks and make sure that she was getting the facts about the lynchings of her community. And so she published those in her father's newspaper. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. This is, some of you might be familiar with the kind of race riots of 1919. I put those in single quotes because I think we tend to think of race riots as, kind of just like running around destroying the city or something like that. I don't know. There's an image we have in mind today that isn't what we're talking about when we talk about the race riots then. And even today, right, when folks might, what we call a riot is often, right, Dr. King talks about riots as the language of the oppressed, that riots are people communicating their frustration because they're not able to do so through the system. That's not actually what we're talking about with these race riots of the early 1900s. These were mass lynchings. These were white mobs attacking and killing and Black people and burning down Black homes. That's what these were. So I use the language of mass lynchings here, but historians tend to use the language of race riots. I followed Carol Anderson, a Black historian who talks about the importance of calling these mass lynchings. So I follow her lead here. The year 1919 is known as the Red Summer because of how many people were killed. Estimates of over 1,000 Black people were killed in 27 massacres throughout the country, occurring in Chicago, to Detroit, to other parts of the South, throughout the South as well. Some of these instances were where white World War I veterans had attacked. Sorry for the typo there. Attack should have a D at the end. White World War I veterans attacked Black World War I veterans. There was a way in which Black veterans, especially Black veterans in uniforms, were seen as a threat. A Black man in a uniform is seen as outside of the racial hierarchy. That's not the way it was supposed to be. And according to white supremacist ideology. And so sometimes these attacks came out of a feeling to put somebody back in their place. Some attacks occurred where white folks would attack Black workers or farmers who are organizing for their rights. Black sharecroppers and tenant farmers were organizing alongside white farmer sharecroppers and tenant farmers too in Elaine, Arkansas, and in some of these instances. And Elaine is just one of the larger attacks. But, so sometimes when Black workers tried to organize to gain economic prosperity and rights, that might lead to attacks. So, right, lynching is a tool to keep people down economically and maintain the hierarchy, the racial hierarchy. You'll notice the image here in the bottom right corner of the Harlem Hellfighters who were served in World War I and were actually awarded a medal by France. And then when they come back to the United States, many Black veterans were treated horribly, because they're living in the Jim Crow United States. And so that's something to keep in mind, right? The way in which Black veterans often can reignite the desire for freedoms and whatnot. There's a few examples I want to highlight. So this is an image of white children cheering when they're burning down a Black home. The spectacles of and the way in which this indoctrinated. This is in Chicago, right? At a time when Black folks are moving north during the Great Migration, which we'll talk about in a couple videos from now, and white folks were threatened in the north or felt threatened, and sometimes would attack Black homes, especially when those Black folks tried to move into traditionally white neighborhoods. There was another instance in Chicago where on Lake Michigan, a Black kid floated on a raft past from the Black part of the beach to the white part of the beach. Chicago, Lake Michigan, Jim Crow segregation. And somebody white on the beach was throwing rocks at the kid to get him back to the Black part of the beach. And they knocked him unconscious. He ended up drowning as a result. And this led to, because the police had refused to arrest the white man who threw the rocks, this led to Black folks demanding that he be arrested. And ultimately, the response from a white mob was to attack Black people and Black homes. That occurred in Chicago. Tulsa is an example from 1921, 2 years after Red Summer. In Oklahoma, Tulsa, most of Tulsa was a white city, but there was a Black section known as Greenwood. This Black township was known as Black Wall Street. It was the wealthiest Black neighborhood in the country at the time. And there was, I'm going to ask that you pause the video in a moment, watch the YouTube video and take notes on the Tulsa massacre. It's a 9-minute video. You can also explore information and a graphic novel or a little, kind of a couple pages of graphic novel style exploration of the massacre in this article here. But it was an instance in which a Black boy walked into an elevator where a white girl was operating the elevator. When the elevator opened, she had screamed. He left. We don't know what happened. Some folks say, he probably stepped on her foot. Folks don't know exactly what happened, but he was accused they interviewed her and they didn't do anything that day, the police, which indicates that probably nothing much happened. But then the next day, there were demands for his arrest. He was arrested. A white mob got wind of it. It was interpreted as a assault on the girl, and they ended up forming a white mob. And while he was arrested in the jail, Black folks came and demanded that that they help protect him. When they were denied, white mob grew, and ultimately it led to a white mob basically burning Greenwood down, the Black neighborhood down. Over 300 Black folks were killed. This was intentionally hidden from the nulnewspapers. You can read about it watch the YouTube video and read about it in the article. Take more details. I'm just giving you a quick overview. But ultimately, they're still trying to find out where some of these Black bodies were buried. So I want to make sure that you learn more about Tulsa. It's important to kind of watch that video. We would have watched it in class. It's important to recognize that Black veterans armed themselves to defend against mob violence. They patrolled their neighborhoods. They formed rings around neighborhoods. They resisted by arming themselves, and it was effective to some degree in certain places. So we want to recognize that kind of resistance too.